I grew up in a world in which, for decades, there was 1/6 of the world, by the year 2000, 1 billion people, who had 80% of the world's income. And then there were 5 billion people who are in the so-called developing world that had 20% of the global income. So much so that as we look out, the so-called 80-20 that I and my contemporaries grew up with is now looking at a very, very different future. It is the future that you will face. It is a future of 9 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. Of the 3 billion extra that have been added to the planet or will be added to the planet from the year 2000, about 100 million goes to the rich countries, and 2.9 billion goes to the developing countries. So come 2050, it's not 1 billion and 5 billion, it's 1.1 billion and 8 billion, or close to it. That is a huge change, dramatic change. The other consequential change is that the structure of the economy is being driven both by the population development and also by modern technology, which has allowed the conveyance of ideas and innovation to move to the developing world. And so the projections today are that that old 80-20 with which I grew up for decades will become 35-65. 35% for the 1 billion in the rich countries, and 65% for the people in the developing countries. That is turning the world on its head in terms of the world that I grew up in.
China might become a larger economy than the United States a lot quicker than people think. Is that the case?
That's right. Nobody seems to have picked this up. The IMF dropped a bombshell sometime, I think, in the last week, very quietly on their website, and no one seems to have picked this up. They have now put out a forecast of when the Chinese economy will overtake that of the United States. When you talk to a lot of Wall Street economists and talking heads, they will tell you, oh, it's decades away and all that stuff. Nonsense. It is 5 years' time, 2016.
But it is the world that you're going to work in. And it is not a trivial change. It is a change of monumental importance. So much so that by 2050, China and India, the two countries that I have, of course, the leading countries in the developing world, will constitute 50% of the global GDP. 50% of the global GDP. That is the consensus estimate. But let's say we're off 5%, it's 45% of the global GDP. It's nonetheless a monumental switch in terms of economic power. Recently, till we had this crisis, the United States had a sort of 10 trillion consumption. European Union had 9. And Asia and the rest of the developing world had a little less than $5 trillion. So it was 10, 9, 5. And the middle class in the world, of whom there are today, or a couple of years ago, was 1.5 billion roughly in the middle class. 1 billion was in the rich countries, in that group that I spoke of. And about $500 million in the middle class, characterized as incomes of between $10 and $100 per capita per week. That this amount of money was demonstrated to be heavily leveraged to those richer countries. By 2030, the estimate now is that there will be 3 billion people in the middle class. And of that 3 billion, 2/3 of it will be in Asia. 2/3 of it. So this is a switch from being a fraction, being less than a third, to being 2/3. And that is a pretty dramatic shift. You'll have a middle class in China of 1 billion people. Billion people by 2050. Middle class. So these are not trivial changes in the outlook. These are tectonic shifts in terms of the way the planet works. And as I said to you, as I look at all of you, in my generation, we didn't have to think about that. In the Dean's generation, it was 80-20 or 78-22 or something like that. It was a balance where you knew you were the rich countries, the powerful countries, and all the organs of running the world were designed to accommodate that fact. Because in Africa, of the 800 or 900 million people that are now there, that will grow to 2 billion people by 2050. 2 billion out of 9 billion. And the estimates are that the average per capita income for people in Africa at that stage will be between $2,000 and $3,000 per capita. The same projections would have China and India at between $30,000 and $40,000 per capita. So you got 2,000 to 3,000, 30,000 to 40,000. And countries in the so-called rich world, United States, European countries, somewhere between $90,000 and $100,000 per capita. So if you have 2 billion people living in a continent with $2,000 to $3,000 per capita, you have China and India with more people, 3 to 4 billion, 3 billion, between $30,000 and $40,000 per capita. And you have the rest of the world somewhere either north of that or in a middle class somewhere between the two countries. The two areas of the world, you have a basis for instability.
China and Nigeria are building one of Africa's largest free trade zones in the commercial capital, Lagos. VOA Africa correspondent Scott Stearns reports Chinese companies will use the facility to manufacture goods for export throughout Africa.
On the tip of the Lekki Peninsula in Lagos, Nigeria and China are building a 16,000-hectare free trade zone to develop local manufacturing and reduce Nigeria's dependence on imported consumer goods. It's one of the fastest-growing areas in Lagos State and will soon have a new deepwater port, an international airport, and new hotels as part of a 60-40 partnership between the Chinese government and Lagos State. Adeyemo Thompson is Deputy Managing Director of the Lekki Free Zone Development Company. He says construction is on schedule for Chinese shareholders that include the China Railway Construction Corporation and the China Africa Development Fund.
In accordance with the master plan and the projections we have made, I think the first phase of the zone, that's the 3,000 hectares, will probably be close to a $5 billion investment.
Africa is not a continent which is any longer isolated.